right, we are live.
Whoop whoop. Welcome to Wayfarers Christian Church.
Welcome to the weekly deep dive. Was trying to do my best not to grunt as I sat down there. But Noah was just pointing out that last week when we started, we do these icebreaker questions at the beginning, and he asked a question, but then he did not get a question asked of him, and I think he was a little bit offended. So we're gonna remedy that.
How dare you?
Starting here. So I've got an icebreaker question for you, Noah.
Okay. What is it?
It's a simple one. Let's assume you're coming to a dinner party at my house.
Uh-huh.
What do you bring?
Is this like just 4, or is this like 8 people, like what you and your family do? Because I probably bring a casserole if it's like 8 people, but like if it's like just y'all, like just Adrian, you and Toby, I'd probably bring something, maybe like a recipe that was like gluten-free for Adrian or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
If it was for 8 people and you're bringing a casserole, what are you gonna?
I probably would do a. I'm a big fan of mushrooms, and so I'd probably do like a roux-based mushroom sauce with Parmesan and rice and maybe some ground beef and throw in there, and celery, onion, garlic, the whole thing, fresh produce and all that jazz. And I'd probably make up something like that, and then top it off with a whole layer of Parmesan on top and bake it in the oven. So,
that sounds great to me. I'm getting hungry already.
I love to cook, so that's if you can't tell.
Perfect. I knew you did. That's why I was like, I'm curious. What would you bring if you were coming over to our house? All right. You said you got a question for me.
Yes, I have a question that you're going to know as soon as I ask it, and you're going to hate me for asking it. And this is subject to change over time. Maybe we'll ask this question again after a couple years of us learning. But in your opinion, over all the books you have read in biblical studies, what is the most important book in the last 50 years?
Yeah, this is a fun one. This is a question. We both listen to a podcast all the time called OnScript.
Shout out to OnScript. Yeah. Go watch it if you really want. Like, if you think like what we're doing is a deep dive, you haven't seen nothing yet.
Yeah, check out OnScript. Highly recommend it. Really, really good. And this is their go-to question that they always ask everybody. What's the most important book written in biblical studies in the last 50 years? So, of the ones I have read, man, this is a good one. I've never thought about how I would answer that question. I've heard so many people answer it, but I have not thought about how I would personally answer it.
I think Leslie Newbegin might be up there for you.
For me, probably. A book called Proper Confidence by Leslie Newbegin. Though, to be fair, that one's more of a theology. Yeah,
it's not like a biblical studies. Yeah.
But yeah, that's my answer.
Okay.
Proper Confidence by Leslie Newbegin. One of my professors in school recommended it to me, and in a lot of ways, it really helped. Helped me get my head straight around what the Bible is actually presenting, and understanding a little bit about human beings, how human beings work, and how communication works. And I don't know, this is all really abstract, but Leslie Newbegin, Proper Confidence, really, really good. He's also really British, so it's lots of fun, big words, and it's very proper.
Yeah.
I love it.
For sure.
That would be my answer. Yeah.
I think.
Do you have an answer for that one?
Yeah. So I think I'm gonna say the same. This is not technically a biblical studies book. It's in the range of it, but I would say mine is How God Became King by N.T. Wright. It was the first N.T. Wright book I bought, and it was the first time I had ever been exposed to the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven, and the gospel told from that perspective, and that just changed my life. So I'd say, like, hands down, like, I was a different person after reading How God Became King than before. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, and that leads really nicely into the topic we're focusing on today.
Segue.
We're going into a little bit more in depth with the beginnings of Genesis. We started with Genesis 1:1 in the sermon on Sunday, and I focused a lot on the importance of understanding how the Bible explains heaven and earth, and about God's plan from the beginning is to bring those two realms together, bring heaven and earth together. And that also for me was something that I first encountered reading books by N.T. Wright. And there was a particular time in my life. I was still working at Avenue Coffee, the coffee shop we both used to work at. And it was a difficult time in my life at this point in time, because I was starting to have a lot of doubts about my faith, a lot of like questions about whether just about Christianity, about the existence of God, all that kind of stuff, which was difficult because Avenue Coffee was like a ministry, and we were supposed to be there to like reach out to minister to other people, but I was kind of already starting to like question things and doubt, and I was just like, man, I don't know how I can like minister to other people when I am having a lot of these questions myself. And I'm very thankful that I found N.T. Wright during that time, because reading some of what he was saying really helped me understand, I guess I would say, how the Bible was, what it was actually trying to say. You know? Because I had been raised to read the Bible in a very particular way. And Genesis was one of the big rubs for me, as it has been for a lot of people. I was having a lot of questions about Genesis, a lot of difficulties really trying to understand it, and really a lot of difficulties coming to a place where I could honestly say, I believe that is how like the beginnings of the earth happened, and all that kind of stuff. I'm somebody that's always been pretty like a science nerd kind of guy, and I remember from like the time I was 5 years old, my favorite TV show was like Bill Nye the Science Guy and like Magic School Bus, and I just loved all of those scientific textbooks in school. I was like a big science guy. Science was like my best section on the ACT and different things like that. So, I loved that. And the more I learned about certain scientific discoveries, the more I was having difficulty believing Genesis as like a creation narrative. And I remember, it's weird. We used to have this like chicken salad sandwich at the coffee shop. I don't know if you remember.
Oh, I definitely remember the chicken salad sandwich. I've made enough of it.
We had to mix up like these giant bowls of chicken salad, like
so much mayo,
giant bowls of chicken salad, like
so much mayo,
like just ungodly amounts.
Poor Becca.
And so we had just this huge bowl that we were mixing up chicken salad in, and some other people were working out front, so I'm in the back kitchen mixing up this just ridiculous amount of chicken salad, and I had my headphones in, and I was just listening to a podcast, and I had tried to look one up on Genesis a little bit because I had some of these questions, and I was trying to get some answers, and I found this one particular podcast where they were talking about it a little bit. And in the podcast, they just start mentioning the similarities that there are between how Genesis describes the beginnings of the world and the Babylonian creation stories, and how the Babylonian people described the creations of the world. And they were just kind of drawing these lines connecting points of similarity between the Genesis story and between the Babylonian creation story. And the reason I think I remember this so bad is because that was like terrifying. I remember when I first read that, I was already kind of in a bad place, already like questioning a lot of things. And it was just this weird moment where I remember just being like, oh no, I don't know what to believe about all of this now. I'm really questioning a lot of this. I've got chicken salad all over my hands. I don't know what to think about creation or the beginning of the world. And I don't know whether to believe the Bible and all this kind of stuff. And
Did you talk to anyone about this, or was this all just...
This was all super internal.
Okay, so you didn't even talk to your dad
problem.
about this or anything like that?
I did, actually. So
Okay.
this is the thing, but later. So what I did is I just kind of internalized it, which was terrible, and I just internalized all of my like difficulties and fears and doubts, which I would tell you all, don't do that. Go talk to people, especially people in your church. I spent a few months just questioning a lot of that, and then finally did go and talk to my dad about it. My dad is also a preacher. He's also been a minister for a long time. And so I kind of brought it up, and it was this super surprising thing where he was just like, oh yeah, I know that. And I was not expecting that at all. Like I thought, I was worried that I was going to like rock his world too once I started telling him all of these similarities between the two stories. Because like if we haven't covered already, part of the reason it's difficult is because historically the Babylonian stories are older. Like they're from more ancient documents. So
according to the dating that may or may not, we don't know, but yeah.
Right. So my fear was that like these Babylonian stories were first, and then the Israelites just kind of like copied them. And you know, I was brought up to believe the Bible was absolutely just directly the Word of God. You know, just came directly from God to Moses, and he just wrote down exactly what God told him to write down. And so it was hard it was just difficult in that moment. I didn't know what to think about any of that, and I just remember being so surprised because I like very cautiously start telling my dad about it. And he's just like, oh, yeah, I know that. I remember that. He said, I learned about that like 20 years ago in seminary. And so he was very helpful in that time. And he was able to kind of explain to me that that this didn't have to rock my world as much as I thought it would. And he kind of gave me some interesting ways to think about it, and I covered a little bit of them in the sermon, but the basic way that I've understood it a lot is that what the early Israelites were doing is, or what's being done in the Bible, what you see being done at the beginning of Genesis, is a sort of commentary on that original the way that they had understood the world to be created. They were kind of riffing on that, commenting on that, basing it on what they already kind of understood about the world, the stories they may have already heard from these Babylonian creation stories or other stories similar. But they were showing them that there are some key differences. And that was the big thing that my dad told me to focus on. He said, don't focus on the similarities between the stories, but notice the areas where they're different. Where are the stories different? Where do they differ a little bit? And when you look at the differences, you kind of start to understand what is the purpose or the intention behind these particular verses in Genesis. Because what I tried to say in the sermon on Sunday was that there's a particular audience in mind to every passage of the Bible. Every verse of the Bible is written to a particular group of people. You know, you can tell that even just, I didn't mention this on Sunday, but even just the language that it's written in proves to you that there's a particular
culture
group of people in mind. So Genesis 1 and following is written in Hebrew because it's written to the Hebrew people, to the Israelites. That's the culture that's in mind when this passage is being written, specifically the ancient Israelites from that era. And I think lots of times we like to think that the Bible just descended from heaven, like just leather bound, perfectly leather bound, exactly like this, with all of the verses exactly in place, and it was in King James English, because that's the true Bible. Is, you know, that's how everybody treats it lots of times. And so we forget that there's like original languages, original audience. There's lots of those kinds of things that were in mind with the Bible. And the way we get meaning out of it in our day and age is that we're like listening in on this conversation that's happening between God and very specific groups of people at very specific points in time.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the issue we have with Genesis is that we think that it is directed at us, that God was speaking to us when he wrote these, when he said these words, when these things kind of came through. And so we read a lot of the words in Genesis, and we think of them from our own point of view, from our own worldview, from our own context. And I think that's where we get into a lot of issues when it comes to Genesis. We are defining and interpreting the words from our own point of view. And what I've discovered is that when we understand that it is being directed at these particular groups of people, these Israelite people, we can, as we overhear and as we pay attention to the conversation that's happening there between God and this particular group of people, that's where I have found that I find more enlightening things, more things that are just really, really encouraging to me, and I feel like I start to see the purposes of those books a lot better.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, you know, your big point in your sermon was that the Bible's not written to you, it's written for you.
Right.
And if you think that the Bible is written to you, you're going to have certain expectations of it as you would any other type of book that was written to you in our time. So like you'll have a viewpoint in which the way that it was written should be like a history book, maybe even.
Right.
You know, like it be like something that is very linear, very the first book and all the way to the last book is going to be the time frame. It's going to start from the oldest point and then move to the newest point.
And so it's going to give you the difficulty is when we start thinking it's written directly to us, we think in our terms.
Right.
And so just as an example, what I spoke about on Sunday was that we define the words heaven and the words earth in very particular ways in our culture today. You know, earth is the physical rock planet that we live on that's floating through space. That's what we call earth. Heaven is this like spiritual world that we see in movies with clouds and harps and golden gates and people in robes. So those two words, we define that way from our culture. But my whole point was that that's not what those words meant to the Israelites, because they didn't know that the earth was a big planet floating through space. They had never been to space. They had no concept of any of that kind of stuff. And then my biggest point especially is that their view of heaven was not that sort of floating in the clouds thing that a lot of us think about. I've mentioned in several sermons already at this point that view is from the Greeks. That's Mount Olympus. That's Greek mythology that's just kind of made its way into our Western culture. And so that's what that view is. So rather than just reading the words and saying God created the heavens and the earth and understanding it the way we would understand those words, I want to understand that he is speaking to the ancient Israelites. So I need to understand those words the way that they did. And that's actually, in a weird way, where this Babylonian creation story ended up really, really helping. It has allowed me and helped me to understand those words the way that they explain it. So, for example, I don't want to ramble on too much about it.
You're good.
But I found this really great article that just kind of quickly explained a little bit about what we're talking about today, and I just wanted to read a couple paragraphs from it for you. I think it'll sum it up better than we can. But it says here. In the middle of the 19th century, archaeologists were digging in the library of King Ashurbanipal. I'm going to say, we're just going to power through it.
I think you did a pretty good job with that.
Ashurbanipal in the ancient city of Nineveh. They discovered thousands of clay tablets written in a language that came to be known as Akkadian, which is a distant and much older cousin to Hebrew. These tablets contained things like laws, administrative matters, and literature. It was like unearthing a time capsule to see what life was like in the ancient Near East 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. But it was the religious texts found there that got the most attention. One of those texts bore striking similarities to Genesis 1. how people viewed Genesis would never be the same again. Found among the ruins was a Babylonian creation story referred to today as Enuma Elish. It is a story about a highly dysfunctional divine family engaged in a major power struggle at the dawn of time. The heart of the story is where the god Marduk kills his nemesis Tiamat and then fillets her body in two, making the skies, the heavens, out of one half, and the earth out of the other. Thus, Marduk claims the throne as the high god in the pantheon of all these gods. Scholars have termed Enuma Elish the Babylonian Genesis. The reason is that both stories share concepts that were immediately apparent, some very similar ones. And it just lists a few of them here. In both stories, matter exists when creation begins. Similar to Enuma Elish, Genesis 1 describes God ordering chaos. There's a chaos that's already there, and he's ordering that chaos. Darkness precedes the creative acts, so there's just darkness first, and then creation in both stories. In Enuma Elish, the symbol of chaos is the goddess Tiamat, who personifies the sea. And Genesis refers to the deep, this word that is in Hebrew very closely connected to the sea. The Hebrew word is Tahom, which is linguistically related to Tiamat. The two words share similar, like...
Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that, but yeah.
So the deep, the sea, Tiamat, which is Tahom. In both stories, light exists before the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. And in both stories, there is a division of the waters above and below, which is always this weird thing in Genesis, where God divides the waters above and below, with a barrier holding back the upper waters. And the sequence of creation is similar. It follows a similar order, including the division of water, dry land, the lights, and humanity, all interestingly followed by rest, by this period of rest. And so there's all of these similarities all the way through. And so when the article goes on to explain, when scholars discovered this, they started to speculate, and they were like, oh, so the Israelites just kind of
copied the
Babylonian one, and all this kind of stuff. And again, that would be the case if you looked at only the similarities, but there are some very key differences in the way that they're explaining the beginnings of the story. And what I think is happening is not so much that that the Israelites copied another story or something like that, but rather that God is using the words and the terms that they're already familiar with to make the point that he's trying to make. He's using, he didn't say the outer mantle crust arose from outside of the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean, because they had no idea of what the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean were, or what an outer mantle crust is. They don't know. They weren't familiar with any of those words. So it didn't, again, if he's speaking to them, it wouldn't have made sense for God to use terms and words that they did not understand. And so he uses terms, he uses concepts, he uses ideas that they're familiar with. And my big belief lately is that what is being told in Genesis is like a theological truth. There's something that's being revealed there about God's character, who God is, and that's what that story is about. It's less about the specific details of how the earth came about, though I think those are in there, but it's more generally what's the purpose of saying all of this? I think the purpose of saying all of this is to just help us understand who God is. Because one thing I didn't touch on in the sermon is that the very first word there, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The Hebrew word there is Elohim, which doesn't have a definite article or anything like that. It's just more literally, it would just be, in the beginnings, a God created the heavens and the earth. There was a God that did this. And then I think what you find in the rest of Genesis, it is God telling us who that God is. What is that God like?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the big purpose I found in a lot of Genesis. And again, like I said, the way you find it is in the differences, not in the similarities, because there's some really key differences. One of which is that God does not have to create through this epic battle like what happens in Enuma Elish, but rather he just creates by speaking. He has this power to create in that sense. And I think it's very clearly setting up God as above any other spiritual being that would exist out there. Any other Elohim would be the other words that they used. And so we could go into all of it. There's a lot of theological points that I think are being made, but that's one of them.
And you'll talk about some of those in your sermons in the next couple weeks.
Yeah,
anyway.
we're going to try to cover a little bit of a few of them in each of the sermons. But you're kind of familiar with the Enuma Elish story. What you want to give us the quick summary of what actually happens in that Babylonian story?
Yeah. So a lot of it focuses in on the battle between Tiamat and the rest of the gods. Most of the gods are cowards, really. They don't really have any courage left, and Tiamat is this raging sea monster that's just destroying everything. And there's one god in particular that actually killed her husband in the myth, and everybody goes to him to try and do it again, basically, and kill Tiamat. And he's like, nope, not going to do it. I'm selfish. And he has his reasons. He thinks he's not powerful enough. And so it's kind of this situation where everything's like in really dire straits for the gods. And they go to Marduk and ask him if he would take care of Tiamat. And he gives like stipulations that like, you're going to crown me as king, basically, and make me ultimate creator of the universe and things if I do this. And he's sort of shown throughout the story to have like all of the attributes of all the other gods sort of like mixed into one. I think is kind of like to supercharge him in the Babylonian myth as like the super god almost. And so, yeah, he takes Tiamat and chops her in half, and like you were saying, divides her up. Half of her body becomes the sky, and half of her body becomes the sea and the land. And very gruesome. It's a very bloody tale, actually. That's probably one of the, if you would just say focus on the differences between the two tales, one of the differences of the stories is that there's so much war up in the Babylonian myth, and the gods are actually like very like famished, hungry. That's actually why they demand sacrifices, according to the Babylonians, is that they're starving, and so you sacrifice animals so that they get fed. And so there's all kinds of dog eat dog kind of world frame in the Babylonian myth.
It's a struggle. It's a
struggle for, and everything's the flavor of the myth is that the strongest will prevail. That's probably the biggest difference, I would say.
The most powerful one that kills and slaughters as many of his enemies as possible. This is the one that's going to prevail.
Exactly.
And Marduk was the god that the Babylonians worshipped as like their supreme god. And so they're telling this story in a way to try to make it clear why worship Marduk, essentially. And I think what you see in the Genesis story is like this kind of snarky way of saying, that's kind of cute, you know, that you guys think that that's how things happen. The real God who made all of this happen did not, didn't even have to, he just had to say it. And it happened. And it was not this this epic battle that was like a difficult struggle. It was the all-powerful creator God creating by speaking.
Yeah, one of the things I'll mention, just as sort of like a teaser, is Tiamat is oftentimes associated with a sea monster or sea serpent, and Genesis 1 makes a very little side note in the middle of, I believe it's day 5, when God creates the birds and the fish.
Mm-hmm.
And after he creates the birds and the fish, there's just this little line in the Hebrew that's like, God also created the great sea serpents of the deep. And then it just moves on. It's just like birds, fish. Oh, when here's a sea serpent, and then we're going to move on to day 6. And some translations try and move away from like great sea serpent. They try and translate it as like great serpents or things like that. So there's different translations, but it's I think that's a little nod,
right? And so again, it's this sort of thing. Like, you guys worship this sea serpent,
right?
That's the
cute.
God that created that sea serpent.
Exactly.
This is the God that's above all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And he has had that power from the beginning. He did not have to fight to earn to be crowned king like Marduk did. He just is.
Because if you read that literally, then you would think that, God created sea serpents, and that's possible. But I think another element to it, at least, is that verse is in there specifically for any Babylonian reader in that time period to read and be like, oh, you're saying he created Tiamat, aren't you? So
exactly. And so I think the example I gave on Sunday was using Donald Trump's slogan for his
that was a great analogy, by the way. Make
America great again. Is the slogan he uses all the time. And ever since he started using that slogan, we've seen a lot of people start kind of riffing on it and changing it a little bit. We have a good friend that runs a coffee company that is all about helping African-American owned coffee culture kind of grow. And so he uses the phrase, make coffee black again, and whenever people in our culture, because we're Americans and we know that that's a reference to Donald Trump, we hear that and we're like, oh, ha, we kind of chuckle.
Right.
We kind of laugh. We're like, oh, I know where that comes from. I remember hearing that one time. But then if you're a big fan of coffee culture and what he's about, then you're kind of be like, but I like this one better. I like what this is about a lot more. And I think that's what the ancient Israelites would have heard when they first heard a lot of these words. They would have been like, oh, yeah. I've heard of sea serpents. I've heard of the deep before. I've heard about splitting the waters before. But I think they would have kind of chuckled to themselves when they noticed the differences in how this story was being told versus the one that they maybe had heard from their neighbors, from the Babylonians, or the Assyrians. That's one of the interesting things that's come up since that discovery, is that we've discovered lots of other cultures, the Egyptians and other people from that era, and a lot of them had also similar stories that had lots of similar components that are also in Genesis.
Yeah, they all had sea serpents, right?
Sea serpents. They all had, waters being split. They all had, this kind of stuff. And so again, I think what God is doing is he's using the language they're familiar with to tell this story. He's using the words and the terms and the concepts that they have heard before to tell them the story about how he is the creator God who is above all of it,
right?
And is not laid into all of it in the ways that some of these other gods and their other stories were. I just love that, in Genesis 2, it says, now the earth was formless and empty, void. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, which is that word that's connected to Tiamat. But then again, so those are the similarities, but then there's this difference. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And it's this just kind of like effortless, existing above it all kind of thing that you really see, I think, a little bit there in what it's saying. It's saying these other gods, they had to get mixed up in all the craziness of the chaos and darkness. But here at the very beginning, you kind of get this vision of God, the Spirit of God, just hovering over those waters.
Yeah.
Kind of observing it, but not being caught up by
that
it.
Hebrew word actually is only used one other time in the Hebrew Bible, and it's only used in relation to birds, actually. And it's this image of a bird just before it's about to drop food into the nest of its young, and it's conveying this idea. I think maybe an English translation that's a little even better than mothering. Have you ever heard of a helicopter mom?
Yeah.
That's basically what that word means. It's like helicopter momming. Hovering, it's like that that doting over something in a very careful and considerate way.
Yep.
Yeah, maybe helicopter mom has a negative connotation,
Right,
but
no.
you get the idea.
Right,
It's like it's
there to care for the child.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what the Hebrew word specifically means. And I think that's one of, again, the other kind of key differences that you can see between the original Babylonian creation story and Genesis. Because like you mentioned, in the Babylonian story, human beings are created, or human beings serve this purpose of like feeding the gods. The gods are hungry, and they're like, we need you to feed us, bring us food. And so in the ancient world, that's how the gods worked, and that's what human beings did. Human beings were like these slaves that were just existed to bring food to the temples, to feed the gods, and to create these beautiful, elaborate homes for the gods. And you see this contrast where God describes in Genesis that he doesn't need anything from us. He's like, I don't need you guys to bring me food. I don't need you to, instead he's described using this very nurturing word, which is just that he is there to provide. He's the provider, the creator who life comes from specifically. He's the one that's providing life. So it's not, so the image it gives us is of a God who doesn't need anything from us, but who instead is providing for us in the way that a parent would. And I think that's a very clear distinction between the God that is revealing himself in Genesis versus the gods that these ancient peoples would have been familiar with. He's a God who doesn't need anything from the people. And I think we've been so Christianized in our culture. Like our culture's just kind of got all of these Christian things that kind of flow through it that a lot of people don't even know are Christian. And the idea of a God being described as a father, we take for granted because we've heard that always from the Christian perspective. Yeah. But that nurturing father way that we are so comfortable with addressing God as was a concept that would have been unheard of for that ancient peoples. And I think you can see kind of pretty clearly here in Genesis that God is revealing himself that way. That is who he is. That is the kind of God that he is.
So let me ask this, because I'm sure might be a few listeners that maybe this is new information to them, just like it was for you when you heard it for the first time. What would you tell your younger self? Because I imagine you're pretty comfortable with this now, right?
I actually think it's really cool now because I realize all the differences, and I'm realizing what God's actually trying to say. Right.
So what would you say to someone that just found out? Oh wow, Genesis 1 has some similarities to the Babylonian myth, and it does appear like the Babylonian myth was written first. What would you say?
Yeah, I would say again, you have to understand. Take it as an opportunity to remind yourself who the original audience that was supposed to be listening to this is, and understand that you are you're a spectator that's listening in on a conversation that's happening, that has happened already. And in general, I think that's just a good I set it up on Sunday as a ground rule because I think that's just a solid ground rule that has just helped me with so many things. Helps me understand the Bible so much better than I ever did before. When I quit feeling like it had to be God speaking directly to me, but rather that I was listening to the way God had talked to so many different people throughout human history. So remember that. Second, remember that God is going to, he doesn't have to do this, but I think it's one of the most encouraging things about God is that he uses the language that we're familiar with to speak to us, The example I've thought of a lot is the gracious, merciful way that God kind of meets us where we are. And I think about that a lot with Peter after Jesus' resurrection. Peter has denied Jesus 3 times. I can't imagine the headspace that Peter is in. He's feeling terrible. He's feeling like he's betrayed Jesus. He's betrayed his teacher. And there's this scene where Jesus appears to the disciples, and Peter recognizes that it's Jesus. And Jesus comes and he has some specific things to ask of Peter, and he asks him, he asks him this question. He said, "Do you love me?" And he uses this very strong Greek word for love called agape love that many of you have probably heard of. And he says, do you agape me? And Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you, that I love you like a brother." And then he says, "No, Peter, do you agape me? Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you, I love you like a brother." And I think in that moment, Jesus recognizes, he can see that he needs to meet Peter where he's at and help him grow towards that agape, help him grow towards that love. And so then that third time Jesus says, "Do you phileo me?" And he uses the word that Peter's been using. And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, yes, I love you." And I think you can see that is an aspect of God's character, that he is he's pulling us to greater things. And I think that's what he's doing in Genesis. There's some really incredible truths that he's trying to get them to understand about himself. But he's using the terms and the words and the stories that they're familiar with to tell that. He's not going way out of left field to tell them the story. He's using the words, he's using the backstory and all of the things that they were already familiar with to tell them the things he's trying to tell them about the fact that he is the creator God, the fact that he is above the fray of it all, the fact that he does not need to, the fact that he has the power to create without needing. That's what he's trying to tell them, but he's using the language they're familiar with. That. And to me, that's been one of the most encouraging things about it, is just recognizing that is a part of how God has revealed himself from the beginning, is that he is going to meet us where we are.
Yeah,
and help pull us.
Yeah, I agree. I think maybe, though, one of the main problems that I know I probably would have had I heard it like at 17 or 18, would have been that I guess my idea of the Bible as inspired was that everything was original from God, lightning zap, to human pen to page,
right.
And so there might be a few people, I wonder, who hear that some of the things in Genesis 1 are not from God, lightning zap, to human to page, but are actually from a Babylonian pen that then came into the Bible. Is that something you ever wrestled with? Is that something that you ever felt was conflicting?
And that was what I had issue with when I first discovered it, because that's what it felt like to me. And I would say, I'm not trying to say that it originated with the Babylonians and that they copied it. I just don't think that's true.
Yeah.
most scholars don't even think that anymore.
Right.
They found so many other stories that are similar. It's hard to say that it originated with anybody. It's hard to say that anybody invented this. It's rather that just these were the words and the terms and the stories that everyone in the world at that point, at that day and age, knew. It was like the common stories, the common thread that they all kind of shared together. And so God's using that common language to do that, to inspire kind of original truth. In general, I think the more you read the Bible, the more that you understand that it is pulling from a lot of other sources from that day and age.
For sure.
It's not, all original. No one had ever heard it before. A perfect example is in later in the Bible, you have the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth law. This very famous one that we've all heard of. And I even remember when I was a little kid in school learning about this thing called Hammurabi's Code, which is this older law code, or older than Genesis, that has that exact same phrase in it: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And so, again, God is using the terms, the phrases, the laws, the stories that those people were already familiar with, but he's helping them understand something new about it. There's
right.
And again, I really do think a lot of it centers around God himself. He's explaining who he is to these people.
Yeah, the example I've always found is probably the most interesting, and there's a lot of debate on this that we won't get into, but is actually in the epistle of Jude, and Jude taking an entire story of Michael and the devil fighting over the body of Moses, which is all pulled from the book of Enoch,
right.
which is not a book in your Bible.
Right. Right. And so it's I like to describe it as it's sort of the thing that preachers do all the time. Like I do this all the time. Like even just Sunday, I referenced Captain America in the Marvel movies, and there's the funny thing about Captain America is he's joined, he was like frozen in time, and so he just awakes again, and he's really old. He used to be fighting in like the world wars, and now he's suddenly in the 21st century, and he doesn't understand any of the references, and so every time people make jokes, he doesn't know what it is because he's never seen those movies, he's never watched those cartoons, he's never done any of that kind of stuff, and so he's like just lost the whole time. And there's this really funny moment in the Marvel movie where somebody makes a joke and he actually understands it. He actually recognizes what they're referencing, and he just is like, I caught that reference. I understood that. I caught that reference. And that's and I mentioned that on Sunday as a way to explain what I think is happening in Genesis.
Yeah.
So I used something that's not in the Bible. I used a
Make America
Disney
Great. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I used a Marvel movie and a Marvel character to explain something that I do think is in the Bible, which is that sort of way that it references itself back and forth. And then that's what I want people to do. I used something from my own culture to teach a lesson that I think is in the Bible. And I think that's what you see happening throughout all the Bible. I think you see God using the stories, the words, the concepts that they were already familiar with, and using those to explain things to them.
So does that mean that I need to get like a biblical scholarship degree before I can understand the Bible then? Is that what we're saying? Or what like how much was I interpreting Genesis 1 wrongly before I knew that it was based on the Babylonian myth?
No, I don't think so. Because again, nobody discovered this Babylonian myth until like 100 years ago. Right. So it's not like we didn't understand it until this point. But I do start to feel like we understand things more fully when we learn some of this kind of stuff. We can understand it more fully. So maybe before we understood it 60%, now we can maybe understand it 80%. I feel like we're moving to higher levels of understanding in that way. But there is this key all throughout the Bible, which is the Spirit of God. And God, through his Spirit, is helping us to understand the words that are being spoken, and he is the one that's speaking them. It says so later on in the Bible. It says all Scripture is God breathed, and that breath word has, close connections to the Spirit, inspired by the Spirit. And so the cool thing is the Spirit is the one who is speaking them, but he is also the one that is inhabiting all Christians. So you have that added benefit of having the one who originally said the words like working in your life to help you understand the words. And so even though we didn't have some of these stories, we've seen people pick up on this already throughout the whole Bible. There's all of these awesome stories of the ancient church fathers and other people who made a lot of these same points about God as creator, God is powerful, God, they were understanding all of it. And you can pick it up from little bits and pieces. I'm just encouraged that we get to understand even more of it the more that we discover. And I also think that is the role that teachers are supposed to play in the church. So I don't think everybody has to go get a biblical studies degree to understand this stuff. But it would be really helpful if at least one person in your church has a biblical studies degree. And I think that's what you see.
I'm working on it, Nick.
Exactly. That's what you see being encouraged in a lot of the New Testament. It says God set out some people to be teachers. And those people that he decided were going to be teachers are the ones that can then go and study the Babylonian myths and get the biblical studies degree, and then give us the quick cliff notes for those of us that hate reading thousands of page books. Give us the quick overview of
why you should love it. It's wonderful.
Yeah. And that's the role that teachers play. That's the role that teachers play in the church is doing the hard work so that we all don't have to. And I think that's really important. That's why I think it's dangerous to have this idea that we need to understand the Bible all on my own, like all for myself. I'm just by myself going to understand everything that's in the Bible. I think God intended for us to be reading it as a community of people, as a church. And each person's playing their part. Each person's bringing a different perspective to it. And after all of that, we can get closer and closer to the truth the more that we study it. So,
yeah, that's good. I think one of the wonderful things that happened to me when I was around 18, 19, 20 was rereading all of the Old Testament in one go. I was lucky enough to be in Robert's classes here at Mid-South Christian College, and we ran through Genesis through Deuteronomy in one semester. And then we went the historical books, so that would have been Joshua all the way through Ezra and Nehemiah the second, and then we went through Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, and then we went through all the prophetic books after that. So I guess that was 2 years. Sorry, but I remember just my whole life I lived and breathed the Old Testament for 2 years, basically, and I was stunned at exactly what you're saying, how much their culture revolved around Genesis 1 and these concepts of heaven and earth. And it's amazing to me how many times even the creation, water above, water below, earth, birds and fish, animals, all pops up in just the whole Old Testament. It's like they were looking at Genesis 1 and always thinking about it as they wrote every book of the Bible that came after it.
Right.
Right.
And so a lot of these stories, a lot of these points, a lot of these things get brought up in Genesis 1, the first chapter of Genesis. And then all throughout the Bible, they're referencing back to it over and over and over again. They're using a lot of the same words, using a lot of the same phrases, using a lot of the same points. And
just for reiteration, why do you think it was such a big deal to them? Why was Genesis 1 such an important thing?
Well, because like I said, I think it's showing them who God is, who the God is that is creating things, and what his purposes were from the very beginning.
Hmm.
So was his purpose to create a group of people who could feed him because he was hungry? No, that was the Babylonian God's purpose. What was this God's purpose? And I mentioned it a little bit, that bringing together of heaven and earth, that nurturing Father who is there to provide, to kind of hover over the waters and provide the way that a mother bird was, all this kind of stuff. I think Genesis is teaching us who God is and what his plan was and what his plan is still currently.
Yeah.
And that's what you learn from it. And so like I said, my hope is that we can feel like Captain America when he did figure that out. And like, I caught that reference. I understood that reference. So hopefully when we read the Old Testament, and it's in the New Testament, too, all over the New Testament, we'll read it. We'll be like, I remember that from Genesis. I caught that reference.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my desire for this whole
We have some time.
series.
Did you want to pull up Psalm 8 and just read Psalm 8 and we can kind of show that reference thing real quick just as kind of a teaser or whatever? Do we have time for that? Or
Yeah, we can do it real quick. We got like 5 minutes here. We'll just end on that. So,
okay, cool.
Psalm 8
Yep.
is one that references...
Yeah, if any of you don't know, Psalm 8 is basically Genesis 1 in poetry form. And I was really excited to read it and start to realize just how close it is to Genesis 1. And so that's one of our goals here is our hope is to show you that it's all the way through Scripture. So you want to go ahead and read it?
Yeah. So just stop me anytime you want to make a point.
Okay, cool.
So this is Psalm 8 for the director of music, according to Gittith, a psalm of David. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth.
Hey, earth.
You have set your glory in the heavens.
Whoa.
Heaven and earth.
It's almost like there's a verse that says God created the heavens and the earth.
Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, which Genesis describes God setting the moon and stars in place.
He's hitting day 1 and day 4 there because he's creating the heavens, and then the place for the place that the sun, moon, and stars reside in is the heavens, and so he's hitting both those.
What is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor.
Side note there, that's Elohim, not angels.
That word angels is Elohim.
That's a little controversial.
We can go into that.
The Hebrew is Elohim there, so he made them a little lower than the Elohim.
You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet. All flocks and herds and animals of the wild.
Day 6.
The birds in the sky.
Day 5.
The fish in the sea.
Day 5.
And all that swim the paths of the seas.
Day 5 as well.
Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And so, again, what I see David saying in this psalm is he recognizes you actually care about human beings. Who are these human beings that you actually care about? Again, that's not the view that anybody had of any of the gods. And God showed the ancient Israelites through Genesis that he's a God who cares about them, who made them to have a certain authority and power, which is a part of his plan. But I'm going to get into that a little bit more on Sunday, explaining exactly what God's plan looked like, and kind of, again, just taking us through a few more steps of exactly what was God's plan. So you will just have to tune in then to hear that. You got anything else before we finish up?
No, we did good.
Cool. So, again, thanks to everybody for tuning in. Hope to see you Sunday. We're live streaming on Facebook and YouTube as usual at Wayfarers CC on all social media. So we hope to see you there as we kind of continue our series in Genesis. Bye, everybody.
Take care.